Thanks to Duxomnium for sponsoring this video. So, when Elizabeth Bennet goes on vacation, it changes her life forever. She tours Pemberley and runs into Mr. Darcy. But exactly why is she touring Pemberley? How could she just show up at Mr. Darcy's house and be like, hey, let me see everything? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about here in today's video. What Regency era vacations were like, how they would tour great houses, and so much more. So if you'd like to learn all about that, then definitely stay tuned for today's video. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. So why did those in the Regency era go on vacations at all? Well, for very similar reasons that we do. In 1782, the author William Gilpin put it this way: "We travel for various purposes, to explore the culture of soils, to view the curiosities of art, to survey the beauties of nature, and to learn the manners of men, their different polities and modes of life." Basically, travel is one of the major ways we learn about and appreciate the world. And this was especially true in the Regency era. Tourism and travel had really taken off as a fashionable pastime. Of course, the ultra-rich were going on the grand tour of Europe, where they would spend sometimes several years just going around seeing all of the art and the architecture and the classical. But even traveling around England was also quite popular, and especially during the time of the Napoleonic threat, when travel on the continent was not as easy for those in England. They were definitely like, we need to go see beauty, but in our own country. Now, one of the main causes behind this rise in tourism was the way they were thinking about the world had fundamentally changed in the 18th century. They started to have new ideas, not only about human nature, and that led to things like the American and French revolutions, but also about art and aesthetics and architecture and music and so many other things that we actually take for granted today. A lot of the way we view art and we view nature is based off of theories that they were just barely developing in this time period. And so some of those early theories were things like the picturesque, which is where you understand landscapes and what would make a beautiful picture. Things like gardening and the way they would landscape the English countryside was dramatically shifting in this time period. And one of those theories that had a major impact on tourism was the concept of taste. To have good taste, you needed to know what separated masterpieces from all the miserable failures. And this ability to have good taste was incredibly important to the Regency gentility. If you had any aspirations to being an educated and refined person, you needed to work on your taste. Now, taste itself in the time period was seen as based on two different factors that we see Edmund Burke lay out in his 1757 A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. That was actually quite a landmark piece in the history of our understanding of beauty and aesthetics. But he basically boils it down to two things. Taste is based on our sensibility and our judgment. So in order to have good taste, you need to be sensible. Basically, you needed to have emotions that could be affected. When you saw a beautiful piece of art, it was like, wow, I am touched by this. If you had a lack of sensibility, you couldn't have good taste. You would have literally no taste. Right? Nothing could ever make you be like, this is beautiful. And thereby you just, you need help. However, you also didn't want to have too much sensibility and be overwhelmed by every little thing, right? Because if you think every piece of art you see is just the most amazing thing in the world because it gives you feelings, then you also lack taste because you lack discernment. So you needed the correct level of sensibility. However, in addition to sensibility, you also needed good judgment. Basically, that knowledge of what actually makes a piece of art good, a piece of architecture good, whether this music is truly inspiring is based off of knowledge and the application of that knowledge. In fact, in Burke's Enquiry, he says this of having wrong taste. The cause of a wrong taste is a defect of judgment, and this may arise from a natural weakness of understanding, or, which is much more commonly the case, it may arise from a want of proper and well-directed exercise, which alone can make it strong and ready. So basically, if you have bad taste, either you're not that smart to begin with, Or you've just been squandering your time. You haven't really put forth the effort to train your understanding, right? This takes well-directed exercise in order to have excellent taste. Now, that's one of the main reasons they wanted to go traveling, because if you needed to have well-directed exercise of knowing what is good versus bad in all of these artistic endeavors, you needed to go see stuff. How could you tell if a great house had amazing architecture if you never went and looked at it? Or if you never saw all of these great masterpieces that were hanging within the grand country houses of the time? Or if you never went and saw the beauties of nature, right? You needed to go train your eyes so that you could have good judgment that leads to good taste and thereby be a well-rounded and sound, genteel member of society. Now, of course, when we're talking about the judgment element of taste, it was based on reason. Your ability to make accurate judgments about art and architecture and so much more showed that you were a reasoning person capable of coming to reasonable conclusions, and it reflected on your overall character as a human being. So, for example, when Lizzy is watching her uncle talk to Mr. Darcy, she is listening to everything they're saying, and she's so relieved that her uncle's coming off great. She finally has a family member that she's not embarrassed to be seeing talking to Mr. Darcy. But what's fascinating is one of the things she lists that she's not embarrassed of her uncle. The book, it says, she listened most attentively to all that passed between them and gloried in every expression, every sentence of her uncle, which marked his intelligence, his taste, or his good manners. So here we have taste listed as something right up there with intelligence and manners. This was something important. This was something her uncle had that she was proud of as a human being. And so we see how important it was to have good judgment so you had good taste and thereby it reflect well on you in general. So let us now follow along on Lizzy's travels, the ones where she will see much of the world, refine her taste and judgment, and be a better person because of it. But first, where is she going to go? Initially, they want to go see the Lake District. However, her uncle's work schedule does not allow them that much time. But if they had gone to the Lake District, that would have been one of the most popular destinations within England. It was beautiful. It was artistic. That's where the poets would go to gain some inspiration. But alas, the lakes were not for them, so they had to content themselves with Derbyshire, which was another very popular destination, of course, with the peaks and so much natural beauty. It was a place that really drew in those tourists. So let us go along to Derbyshire. So we know the gardeners come and get Lizzy from Longbourn and then they set off on their trip. The book says the gardeners stayed only one night at Longbourn and set off the next morning with Elizabeth in the pursuit of novelty and amusement. So they would have been traveling by carriage. Now this could have either been a rented traveling carriage that was specific to this trip, or it could have been one of the family carriages, which might have been a little bit heavier and take them a little bit longer. They would have gone at a slower pace. However, whatever the case, one thing that they would have definitely been renting was horses. So horses were rented post on travels, which means that every so many miles, about 7 to 10 miles, you would change your horses out at a posting inn. Now, what you would do is you would rent some horses, and they would usually come with a coachman or a postilion that would come and take care of them, drive them the next 7 or 10 miles to the next posting inn. And then when you switched out the horses there, that postilion or coachman would take care of the horses and take them back to the original inn that you rented them from. So basically, every 7 to 10 miles, you were just renting new horses, and then the guys that came with them were taking them back. And of course, this arrangement allowed you to go farther faster because horses tired out. Also, the coachmen and the postilions that are coming with these horses are used to traveling within that vicinity, right? They know all the right roads. They're not going to get you lost. So there's that insurance there too. Meanwhile, at these posting inns, while you're waiting for the horses to be changed out, you might stay in your carriage. You might get out of the carriage and just like stretch for maybe like 15 minutes. You might go into the posting inn that was usually also having a restaurant restaurant component and a hotel component. Sometimes people would take a quick meal there, eat their full meal there, or at the end of the night, when you've been traveling for so many hours and you're like, I am exhausted, you would more than likely just rent a room at whatever posting inn you ended up in. And so the posting inns, what you would do is you would request a set of rooms. So, for example, about halfway between Longbourn and Oxford, which was their first stop, would have been about 30 miles of travel. So they would have stopped there at that inn and been like, oh, let's rest for the night and go on to Oxford tomorrow. We need a suite of rooms. So basically, rooms were more of a suite in the era than a singular hotel room as we know it today. It would have had a common sitting room with several small bedrooms off of it. So they would have probably ideally requested a sitting room and 3 bedrooms, because it was common for married couples to have different bedrooms, even in a hotel. However, if that was not possible, they would have had a sitting room and 2 bedrooms where maybe Elizabeth got her own room, or she would have shared it with her aunt. Meanwhile, they would have also had a chambermaid at this hotel, which is kind of like the maids in hotels today. They were responsible for cleaning the rooms, bringing up fresh water for people to wash with, and also changing the bedding. Basically, they were the maids of the hotel. Now, of course, we know a famous scene in Pride and Prejudice where there's a chambermaid is when Lizzy is asking one hey, are the Darcys at home? And the chambermaid is like, no. So they could also supply you with some gossip. They were often called as witnesses in adultery cases because they could be like, yeah, this couple came, I made up their beds, and guess what? In the morning, even though they had 2 bedrooms, only one of the beds was used. Yeah, they were dishing out all the gossip at divorce trials. Doubtlessly, Lizzy and her aunt and uncle did not give the chambermaid that much gossip, and they just moved on the next day, renting some new horses and heading on to Oxford. So Oxford is, of course, the home of Oxford University, which was the alma mater of many of Jane Austen's family members, both currently in her life and previously. And so she had a little thing for Oxford. Now, Oxford as a university town was kind of different from what it is today. Current University of Oxford has something like 26,000 students. Meanwhile, in Jane Austen's time, it had 2,000 to 3,000 students. So the student population was still immensely smaller. However, it did have a major impact on the town. A traveler in the time period described Oxford this way. It looked old, dusty, and worm-eaten. The streets silent and deserted. A few students walking lazily, dressed in black gowns and caps, overshadowed with a singular sort of ornament, a thin board about a foot square, covered with black and with tassels designating the rank of the scholars. So you did see scholars wearing their little scholarly outfit in this worm-eaten town. I love that description. It's like, this is so worm-eaten. Of course, not all was hopeless in this worm-eaten town. These universities did have glorious libraries, beautiful architecture, and some very pretty gardens in between them that Lizzy could have strolled through with her aunt and uncle and seen all the students scurrying about. So after a few days of seeing Oxford, Lizzy and her aunt and uncle would have set off on the next part of their journey. About 8 miles away, they would have checked into an inn at Woodstock, requested some rooms, maybe got some light food, and then headed off to see the main attraction there, called Blenheim Palace. It was described this way during the time period. One of the most magnificent piles of architecture in this kingdom, and perhaps in the world, stands in the finest part of one of the finest counties in England. It was the seat of the Duke of Marlborough, and quite the main tourist attraction. A great country house that everyone needed to tour. But exactly how did some guy's house turn into a tourist attraction? And what were the rules in visiting these country houses, right? How could Lizzy just show up at Pemberley and be like, hey, you want to let me in? Well, here, guys, is the story. Country house visiting had originally evolved out of hospitality. The really rich used to be able to go and visit each other, and as they would, they'd be like, oh, look at this guy's art collection, or ooh, I like what they did with the architecture there, I might do that in my house. However, eventually, as these ideas of taste and beauty and aesthetics grew in the 18th century, and so many more people were like, hey, I want to come check out your house. It became slightly overwhelming, and the dynamics of the relationship changed to one of basically realizing your house was now a tourist attraction. So now we just have a cat visiting us. Sir, do you want to visit great country houses? Is that why you're here? So this left householders in an awkward situation. Of course, now if you visit a great house in England, more than likely you're going to be charged a fee, given a little brochure of what to expect in the house, and it's been completely commercialized. However, that hadn't happened in this time period. These homeowners were caught between feeling the need to have this traditional hospitality to visitors, and also now just being inundated with so many people, and they didn't know what to do with them. Some even felt like they were not free in their own house because there were always just like the steady stream of tourists being shown around by their housekeeper. And some like literally had to run away from the tourists. They're like, I have to go hide. There's someone touring my house again. So homeowners started establishing certain boundaries. Obviously, if people had to look a little bit genteel to be even admitted to these fine houses. But in addition to that, there were restrictions on the times they could come. So for example, at Blenheim, these were the rules. Blenheim may be seen every afternoon from 3 to 5 o'clock, except on Sundays and public days. Company who arrive in the morning may take the ride of the park or the walk of the gardens before dinner, and after that, visit the palace. Basically, they were like, okay, here are our hours of tours. And every house had their different rules. Some houses were only open on, say, Mondays and Wednesdays, or the first Tuesday of every month, or between these specific hours. But basically, they were trying to regain some of their privacy that was just being overwhelmed by tourists. However, I do think it's funny how at Blenheim, you could be in their gardens any time of the day. Imagine being like someone who lived in that house and be like, I would go walk in the gardens, but I just have to walk with all the tourists at my own house. Now, of course, when you showed up at a house to tour it, you had to request a tour from the servants that you met. And these servants all expected a tip. One traveler during the time period put it this way: the domestics of these noble houses are generally as obsequious as innkeepers, and from the same motives. Porters, footmen, gardeners waited upon us immediately. Basically, the servants were like, oh, you look genteel enough to be able to, give us all some tips. We're letting you into the house. And we see, of course, later when Elizabeth goes to Pemberley, it is the housekeeper who is giving them the tour. And that was pretty common. A housekeeper, one of her jobs would be to take people around the house. She was often even provided with a little booklet that let her know like the different dimensions of the room. So for example, the housekeeper of Pemberley, it says she related the subjects of the pictures, the dimensions of the rooms, and the price of the furniture. Basically, these women had to be experts on everything in the house because they were also tour guides as part of their job description now. However, when it came to really, really big houses like Blenheim that were major tourist attractions, people actually sold guides to these houses. You could buy the guide to Blenheim before even going, so you had even more details about everything. So as Lizzy mentions later in the story, you get to see the fine carpets and satin curtains of these houses. But more importantly, you got to see their art collections. Because of course the ultra wealthy were the patrons and collectors of art during this time period, and that had been the work of generations in their family to build up these massive art collections. So for example, at the Palace of Blenheim, the Duke's dressing room alone had 15 different pieces of artwork in it, including by masters like Rubens. So basically, just going to the dressing room was like going to an art museum. Now, of course, these families would have continued to collect artwork throughout the generations, including in the Victorian era, which brings us to this video's sponsor. So Ducksomnia makes the absolute most gorgeous board games. From being a Rococo gardener in Lafleur to a Victorian botanist in botany, they create immersive, historically inspired worlds that I just love escaping into. And they just launched a new game. It's called Artistry. Artistry transports you to the turn-of-the-century world of Art Nouveau, where you are a new artist gaining a reputation by collecting materials and different patterns and recruiting other artisans to work for you so you can have the most renowned studio of all time. I absolutely love this game. It's not only beautiful, but easy to learn and play, and it makes me want to host a girls' game night for ladies of refined sensibilities because it is such a high quality game. It's made with heirloom materials, has things like gold foil and linen texture on the cards, and overall it creates such a wonderful aesthetic experience as well as a fun one. And really, from the beauty of the art, the attention to detail, and the historical opulence of the setting, I just love this game, and it's right up there with other Ducksomnium games that I absolutely adore too. But for a limited time, you can order the special edition of Artistry that's called the Jewelry Box Edition that has so many little cool upgrades to it, including metal bust game pieces. Is that not just like the coolest game token ever? Anyway, definitely check out Artistry today by clicking the link in the description below or by going to ducksomnium.com. Thanks so much, sponsorship Ellie. So now that they have seen Blenheim, they go back to Woodstock, have a good night's sleep in their suite of rooms, and then head off the next day to see Warwick. So Warwick was upon the list of every tourist, but wasn't necessarily the most spectacular thing if you compare it to Blenheim. But it was nice enough, and you needed to see it if you were on a trip. Then, after that, do you know what you would see next? Kenilworth. Kenilworth was absolutely amazing because it was picturesque because it was destroyed. It's a ruined castle, and what is more romantic during this time period than a ruined castle? Nothing. Of course, it was once a formidable medieval fortress, but at this point, you just got some picturesque castle ruins. But all of this picturesqueness is training Elizabeth's eye for better judgment. So how do you top seeing a ruined castle? I don't know, but you know what you do? You go on to Birmingham. So Birmingham was a bustling city during the time period with so many manufacturers. And it was called the toy shop of Europe because it was producing so many little trinkets and cool things. And you could go and tour these different facilities, see how all the stuff was made. One traveler during the time period said this: in one place, 500 persons were employed in making plated ware of all sorts, toys and trinkets. We saw there were patent carriage steps flying down and folding out of themselves as the door opens or shuts, chairs and walking sticks, pocket umbrellas, extraordinary cheese toasters, and a multitude of other wonderful inventions upon which much ingenuity seems wasted. All the ingenuity just going into the little toys and gadgets of the world. But it was a cool change of pace and allowed Elizabeth to see a whole different side of life, right? You had ruined castles, and then you had people making little trinkets. Now, after seeing all of the bustling little city moments, you know what Lizzy and her aunt and uncle are in the mood for? Nature. So they head on to Dovedale. Now, Dovedale was kind of what we would think of today as like a national park. It was this beautiful natural scenery that was famous, and this is how it is described. Dovedale, near Ashbourne, is a narrow, winding glen among a variety of hills and rocks, through which the River Dove takes its course for about 2 miles. It is bound in a very romantic manner by hills, rocks, and hanging woods, which are extremely various, and the hills in particular of a very bold and striking character. They spread on all sides in vast sweeps, inexpressibly magnificent, and are much more striking than anything else at Dovedale. The rocks are in some places very romantic, rising in various shapes from the banks of bill and wood, and forming a wild assemblage of really romantic objects. The course of the river is various, from a gentle current to a great rapidity over broken rocks, in some places falls, but not in a bold manner. The fragments of the rocks in it, with breaches of wood growing from them, are truly romantic and picturesque. Truly romantic and picturesque. I don't think Regency travelers could honestly ask for anything better. And Dovedale definitely makes a major impression on Elizabeth, because later when she runs into Mr. Darcy at Pemberley and she needs something to talk about him with, but like everything else is too awkward to talk about, you know what they talk about? Dovedale. The book says, at last she recollected that she had been traveling, and they talked of Matlock and Dovedale with great perseverance. Right? They were like, safe topic, Dovedale's beautiful. Did you see those romantic hills? Look at the picturesque broken rocks with water flowing over it. It was beautiful. I love Dovedale. And in that quote, it says she talked about Dovedale and Matlock. So after Dovedale, her and her aunt and uncle would have headed on to Matlock, which was this quaint little aesthetic town. A traveler of the time period describes it this way. Our second stage has been Matlock, the country varied, cultivated like a garden, and covered with gentlemen's houses, elegant cottages and farmhouses, spires and towers of small Gothic churches, some of them very beautiful, peeping over groves of trees. And Matlock was famous for its beauty, both natural, it had natural springs, its town was very cute and quaint, and sure enough, it left a great impression on Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. They could both have their safe little conversation about how Matlock was beautiful. Now, after Matlock, they may have headed on to the Peak District and seen all the beauties there. But something else they may have been on the lookout for was a cavern. So the area around Matlock and the Peak District had a bunch of caverns in it that people would mine different things. And a traveler during this time period mentions it this way. The whole country about is honeycombed or perforated with mines of lead, of coals, and other minerals. Their galleries have led to the discovery of innumerable grottos and caverns. We penetrated half a mile into one of them, which extends horizontally to a much greater distance, branching out in many directions. Several of the passages have been walled up to prevent some of the keener tourists being lost in the intricate mazes, and all their discoveries along with them. The rocks yawn in frightful vents above and below, and enormous blocks lie about detached, nobody can tell from where. The sides are in many places resplendent, with bright incrustations and crystals of calcareous spar. In low places, you might get honorable wounds from their sharp projections if you forget to stoop. So in this passage, we hear about spars, which is actually something mentioned in Pride and Prejudice. When Lizzy is first thinking about going into Derbyshire, she says this, "But surely," she said, "I may enter his county with impunity and rob it of a few petrified spars without his perceiving me." So this is something Lizzy's actually interested in collecting, are these petrified spars. She might be referring to something called fluorospar, which Derbyshire was actually famous for a specific subtype. I believe it's called Blue John. Here are some examples of different trinkets that would be made with Blue John fluorospar. However, Lizzy's like, there are these caverns. You can collect fluorospar. I'm going to go do that, and Mr. Darcy never has to know. So Lizzy has now seen the beauties of Matlock and Dovedale and the Peak and collected some spar while she's at it. But you know what's coming up next? They need to check in at the inn at Lambton and then go see Pemberley. And Pemberley is absolutely gorgeous, but there's so many details about her visit to Pemberley that we need to go into. So we'll have to save that for a different video, but let us continue on Lizzy's journey. Now, of course, we know after Lizzy tours Pemberley, her whole trip gets cut short because Lydia runs away. But alas, she still had a great vacation up until that time. Anyway, let me know in the comments down below. Would you want to go on a Regency era vacation? Would you be trying to improve your taste and judgment? Or would you just be like, this is fun. Look at that pretty glen. Those rocks are so romantic. Let me know in the comments down below. And definitely remember to check out this video sponsor. Remember to check out Artistry, the game that will transport you to the world of Art Nouveau by clicking the link in the description below or by going to ducksomnium.com. And as always, guys, keep being awesome because you're awesome.